A new police chief walks into his precinct undercover, hoping to get a real look at how things operate when nobody's pretending. But when a white officer spits in his face, thinking he's just some random guy off the street, the whole room is seconds away from a moment they'll never forget. It was a humid Tuesday morning in August when Richard Nelson, the newly appointed police chief, stepped out of his car. He was in Blue Ridge, a small city nestled in the rolling hills of North Carolina, wore a plain plaid shirt, faded jeans, and beat-up sneakers. Nothing about him screamed, "Chief of Police." That was the point. After spending 20 years working his way up in law enforcement, Richard didn't want to be greeted with fake smiles or cleaned-up versions of the truth. He wanted to see the precinct as it really was, a black man taking over a department that had long been rumored to have serious problems. Richard knew what he was walking into. He wanted to experience the workplace without filters or formalities, and the best way to do that was to walk in unnoticed. The parking lot was alive with movement, officers coming and going, chatting casually, some throwing quick glances his way. Nobody recognized him. That wasn't surprising. His appointment had only been announced a few days earlier, and he had purposely kept his arrival quiet until the official inspection scheduled later that day. He pulled down the brim of his baseball cap and took a steadying breath. The job ahead was a heavy one, digging out whatever was rotting inside this department. And while he'd faced pushback before, he had a feeling this assignment would push him further than any he'd had before. As he got closer to the building, he heard distant laughter drifting through the warm air. He entered the precinct through a side door, unnoticed. Inside, the buzz of voices, ringing phones, and footsteps filled the room. The tile floors gleamed under bright, harsh fluorescent lights, and the smell of old coffee lingered. Richard moved slowly, observing the flow of the room. Officers were gathered around desks, some joking, others flipping through paperwork. Nobody paid him much attention until he stopped near the break room. "Hey you!" a sharp voice snapped. Richard turned to see a white officer walking toward him with a smug grin on his face. His badge said Officer Daniels. Behind him, a few others leaned against the wall, watching with interest. Richard started to say something, but Officer Daniels cut him off. "Lost or something?" "This isn't a shelter," he said with a mocking tone. "You need to take that mess somewhere else." Richard stood still, the words hitting hard. He didn't know whether to reveal who he was or let the situation play out. Before he could decide, Daniel stepped in even closer, raising his voice just enough so everyone nearby could hear. "You deaf? I said get out of here. We don't need your kind hanging around." Laughter broke out from the others nearby. Richard clenched his jaw, his heart thudding in his chest. He tried to speak, but Daniels leaned in, his face just inches from Richard's. Then, without any warning, the officer spit right into Richard's face. Everything seemed to freeze. Richard's breath caught in his throat as he felt the warm spit slide down his cheek. Around him, the room erupted with laughter. One officer slapped the table, nearly doubling over in amusement. Another mumbled something about putting the riffraff in their place. Richard's thoughts were racing. He could feel his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Still, he stayed calm. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out a handkerchief and slowly wiped his face, his movements steady and deliberate. "Is this how you treat everyone who walks through these doors?" he asked. His voice was calm, but there was strength behind it. Daniels gave a smug grin. "Only the ones who don't belong here," he replied. That triggered another round of laughter from the group. But Richard didn't respond. He simply turned and walked away, heading down the hallway without saying another word, moved toward the precinct's main office, leaving the officers and their laughter behind. Just then, the intercom crackled to life. "All personnel, report to the briefing room." It was time. The briefing room buzzed with activity. Officers began filing in, some carrying coffee mugs, others still laughing and sharing private jokes. Richard entered quietly through a side door. In his hand was a folder stamped with the precinct's official seal. He paused, standing slightly out of view, and looked over the room. It was filled with familiar faces, some of them still smirking from what had happened earlier. The front of the room, Captain Harris, a stocky man with a graying mustache, raised his voice to get everyone's attention. "All right, settle down everyone," he called out. "We've got an important introduction to make today." The room began to quiet. The officers were curious now. Daniel stood near the wall, arms crossed, that same smug look still stuck on his face. He was clearly enjoying his morning. Captain Harris cleared his throat. "As most of you know, Chief Caldwell retired last month. We've been waiting on his replacement. And today, I'm proud to introduce our new leader, a man with an outstanding record and a strong vision for where this department is heading." Richard stepped forward. His steps were slow and steady, each one full of purpose. The room went completely silent as he approached the podium. Everyone's eyes were on him. He placed the folder on the lectern and calmly looked out at the crowd, scanning the room from left to right. His calm presence didn't ease the tension, it made it even more intense. Daniel's smug grin started to fade. The color drained from his face as realization hit. The other officers glanced at each other, uneasy. Some whispered quietly. Others just stared at Richard with wide, stunned eyes. "Good morning," Richard said calmly. "My name is Richard Nelson. As of today, I'm your new chief of police." The room fell completely silent. Daniel's face turned a deep red. All his confidence disappeared. Richard locked eyes with him, longer than what felt comfortable, before slowly shifting his focus to the rest of the room. "I came in early this morning," Richard continued. "I wasn't in uniform. I wore regular clothes because I wanted to see things for myself, to get a real sense of this department without anyone changing their behavior for show." A quiet stir moved through the crowd, but Richard calmly raised his hand. The room went quiet again. "Even in the short time I've been here, I've seen things that are not just unprofessional, they're completely unacceptable." He paused, letting that sink in. "Let me be absolutely clear," he said. "The kind of behavior that's been allowed to grow here, it ends today." No one said a word. The silence was thick. Everyone could feel the shift in the air. Daniel shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his eyes avoiding Richard's. Richard stepped forward to the edge of the podium. His voice stayed steady but had a sharper edge now. "Respect is not something you get to choose, it's the foundation of law enforcement. Without it, we don't just fail each other, we fail the people we're supposed to protect." He paused again, letting his words hang in the air. Several officers looked uneasy under his gaze. "This morning," he said, "some of you laughed. You thought you were watching just another man with no power being put in his place." He took a slow look across the room. "But I'll say this loud and clear, every single person who walks through those doors deserves to be treated with respect. Whether someone wears a badge or not, respect is non-negotiable." Richard's voice sliced through the stillness of the room. No one moved a muscle. The air was thick with tension. He didn't speak again right away. He let the silence do the talking. His eyes swept across the room, sharp and focused. Every officer there could feel the weight of his words. Officer Daniels shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. Sweat began to form on his forehead, but Richard wasn't finished. "I get it, change is hard," he said, voice calm but full of authority. "But let me make this crystal clear. There is zero tolerance for any kind of behavior that disrespects a person's dignity. I don't care if it's a fellow officer, a civilian, or anyone else." He stepped down from the podium, walking slowly and deliberately toward the group. His presence alone was powerful. His voice, though controlled, carried strength. "Officer Daniels," he said, stopping just a few feet from him. Daniels flinched. All the confidence he had earlier vanished in an instant. "You," Richard continued, locking eyes with him, "are the very example of what's broken in this department. When you spit in my face, it wasn't just about disrespecting me, it was a slap in the face to the badge, to the oath we all took, and to the community we promised to serve and protect." Daniel stammered. "Chief, I didn't know." "That's exactly the problem," Richard cut in sharply. "You didn't care to know. You didn't stop to think before you acted, because you assumed the man standing in front of you didn't matter. And that kind of thinking, that assumption, is exactly why this department has lost the trust of the people it's supposed to serve." The room was silent. Not a single officer moved. Richard turned his gaze to the rest of them. "What I saw that day wasn't just one man's mistake. It was the result of a culture, a toxic culture, where bullying and prejudice aren't just allowed, they're encouraged. And that ends right now." He returned to the podium, his voice rising just a bit. "I've spent my entire career fighting for justice, not just out there on the streets, but in places like this, within the very walls of departments like ours. Change is never easy, and it's not going to happen overnight. But hear me when I say this, as long as I'm chief, this precinct will stand for integrity, respect, and accountability." He paused, giving his words a moment to land. Then, with a slight nod to Captain Harris, he said, "Effective immediately, Officer Daniels is suspended, pending an internal investigation." He looked around the room. "And if anyone here thinks this is just a slap on the wrist, think again. This is only the beginning of the changes coming your way." Gasps filled the room. Daniel's face turned red. His jaw clenched. He couldn't bring himself to meet anyone's eyes, but Richard stood firm. "This isn't about punishment," he said firmly. "It's about setting a standard. If you're not willing to live up to it, then you don't belong here." He scanned the room one last time, making eye contact with each officer. "If you're ready to improve, to do better and be better, then we move forward. Together. I'm going to hold you accountable every step of the way." Those were the last words spoken before the meeting ended, and it ended in a thick, uncomfortable silence. The officers quietly left the room, no small talk, no jokes. Just the sound of shoes scraping the floor. Richard stayed behind, standing at the podium, his eyes following Daniel as he stormed out. Daniel's face was a clear mix of shame and frustration. Around the room, no one looked Richard in the eye. Their faces said it all. Some looked guilty, others just seemed lost in thought. Later, back in his office, Richard dropped into his chair and let out a long breath. He knew this moment was only the start. Deep-rooted attitudes don't shift overnight, and for some people, they might never shift at all. But Richard didn't come to Blue Ridge to win a popularity contest. He came to make a real change. The phone rang. He picked it up. "Chief, it's Captain Harris," the voice said, careful and uncertain. "I just wanted to say, you handled that better than most would have." "Thanks, Captain," Richard replied. "But this is where the real work begins. I need a complete review of Daniel's record on my desk by tomorrow. Every complaint, every incident report, everything." "You've got it," Harris responded. Then he paused. "Chief, I think you shook a few of them up today. In a good way." Richard didn't say anything more. He just hung up the phone, letting himself feel a small moment of satisfaction, just a moment, before turning his attention to the stack of paperwork waiting for him. And the weeks that followed, things started to feel different at the precinct. The same officers who used to laugh at Daniel's behavior were now avoiding him altogether. Whispers about his suspension made their way through the halls. Richard made it a habit to walk through the building often. He greeted people by name, made sure they saw him. He didn't say much, but his presence reminded everyone that things were changing, and leadership was paying attention. Some officers took that message seriously. One afternoon, Officer Reyes, a newer recruit, caught up with Richard. She looked nervous but determined. "Chief," she said, "I need to be honest. I went along with the toxic behavior because I was scared to speak up. I didn't want to be targeted. I want to do better. That's all I ask," Richard told her gently, but with firmness in his voice. "It starts with you. But not everyone was ready to grow." Daniel filed an appeal against his suspension, insisting he was being treated unfairly. Richard stood firm. He wasn't backing down. To him, accountability wasn't just a word, it was non-negotiable. The department's internal review had brought to light a long list of past complaints against Daniels, everything from using too much force to making inappropriate remarks. Daniels tried to appeal, but it was rejected. Richard didn't mince words. He made it clear, covering up bad behavior wasn't going to be tolerated anymore. Even with the steps forward, Richard knew there was still a long journey ahead. Discussions around hidden biases and better relationships with the community didn't always go over well. Reactions were mixed, but that didn't stop him. Every little win mattered, new recruits speaking out, an officer taking a moment to think before acting. Each of those moments meant progress. One morning, Richard attended a neighborhood event. While he was there, a young boy slowly walked up to him, a bit shy. "Are you really the chief?" the boy asked, eyes wide with curiosity. "I am," Richard answered, smiling kindly. "My dad says the police don't care about us," the boy said quietly. Richard knelt down so he could look him in the eye. "I can't change what's already happened," he said gently. "But I promise you, we're doing everything we can to make things better. And if you ever need anything, you come find me. Deal?" The boy gave a small nod, a tiny smile creeping onto his face. Moments like that reminded Richard why he took on the job in the first place, why the time his first year came to a close. Things weren't perfect, but they were definitely changing. Officers who couldn't get on board with the new direction had moved on. In their place were fresh recruits who truly believed in Richard's mission, to build a department that treated people with fairness and respect. The community, once doubtful and distant, had started to notice the difference. There was a new effort to rebuild trust and close the gap between the badge and the people. One evening, Richard stood in the main hallway of the precinct, watching as officers finished their shifts and headed out. The chatter and laughter felt different now, real, friendly, not at anyone's expense. Knew there would always be hurdles to face. But for the first time, he felt real hope. Change wasn't easy, but every step forward was worth it.